So as Liz said, I am a co-founder of No Waste Louisiana. I am also a senior campaigner with the Center for International Environmental Law, who specializes on plastics and petrochemicals. Both of those organizations are signatories and allies to the Gulf South for a Green New Deal, which you'll see again at the end of this presentation. If you are not also a supporter and signatory of the Gulf South for a Green New Deal policy platform, the website where you can do that is on the last slide. Next, please. So there are 5 things I want you to take away from this presentation. The first one is that fossil fuels and petrochemicals will not and cannot be the future of Louisiana's economy or anybody's economy. The second thing is that to stay below 1.5 degree warming, we have to start reducing and not just offsetting carbon emissions now, not by 2050, now. The third thing is that in order to protect the health of Louisiana's people, we have to reduce all emissions, not just carbon. If carbon is the only thing we're worried about, the people in Louisiana are going to continue to feel the pain of oil, gas, and petrochemicals. The fourth thing is, unfortunately, but probably not surprisingly, the governor's Climate Initiatives Task Force is overrun by oil and gas interests. But the fifth thing is we have a lot of power to influence the Climate Initiatives Task Force, and we already have a space through which we are doing that. Next, please. So let's take these one at a time. So fossil fuels and petrochemicals will not be the future of Louisiana's economy. What? Doesn't that sound crazy? What does that mean? Next, please. What we know is that oil and gas right now sees petrochemicals, which is plastics, but not only plastics. It's also in many ways, it's fertilizers and pesticides and all of the chemicals that result as byproducts from petrochemicals. They right now are the largest driver of global demand oil growth. Everything else is going down, especially as we're talking about electrifying everything. You can't electrify petrochemicals. So that is actually where the oil and gas industry sees their primary profit-making source in the future. Next, please. But the markets for both oil and gas, which is what you see in the far left red bar here, and chemicals and agriculture, which includes all the things I just named, plastics, pesticides, fertilizers, in the other red bar, all of those are going down. The market capitalization has declined across all sectors, but especially oil and gas and chemicals and agriculture. This is a story about the pandemic, but it is also a story that was happening pre-pandemic. These declines and these patterns were showing long before the world's demand for burnable fossil fuels plummeted. Next. So the second thing that we should take away from this presentation is that we have to start reducing those emissions now. Next. This is a graph that was actually just published a couple of days, actually yesterday. This graph shows pathways to net zero by 2050 as presented by Shell, so specifically the Shell company. This is actually showing based on whether or not they move slowest, essentially taking the longest to reduce those carbon emissions by 2050, or whether or not they start today. The black line along the bottom of this is them starting today. The brown line along the top is emissions very slowly, incrementally changing over time. What we have to keep in mind is that it is the cumulative emissions that count. It's all of the carbon that we have released into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution that is an issue. It's not just the time. It's actually how much they build on each other. So if we allow these companies to keep increasing oil and gas sales without actually reducing those emissions right now, the cumulative effect is going to still push us over 1.5 degrees unless we start doing something today. That is the other side of what Logan was saying in her presentation about why oil and gas companies say things like net zero by 2050. The other side of that is that This Shell's current, what they call the sky scenario, actually allows them to continue increasing their sales of oil and gas. And the way that they're doing that is by making those emissions more efficient. So they're using the technologies that are somewhat theoretical to do things like capture the carbon. They're making the use of that energy, quote unquote, more efficient, which obviously our energy use is getting more efficient all the time. But what that means is that they're selling more energy. So they're still selling more oil and gas, even as they're being able to claim that the emissions are moving toward net zero. And that the emissions are going down because they're capturing that carbon. And when they're capturing that carbon, they want to do things like store it underground. They want to do things like use it for fracking to get more oil out of the ground. And yet all of the models, Penny earlier mentioned needing more models. All of the models around net zero by 2050 and around carbon capture actually don't take into account the carbon that's going to end up being used down the road if the captured carbon is used to do things like pull more oil out of the ground. So there's a lot of tricky math that is actually happening in the models that say that these companies can even get to net zero and by any other path than reducing emissions immediately. So remember that cumulative is what counts, and we have to start reducing now because of that. Next. The third thing to remember is that all of these scenarios, the sky scenario, the conversation by these companies, all of it is only talking about reducing carbon. And we have got to reduce all emissions. This is a life or death situation. As somebody once told me, if the thing you are worried about is the molecule of carbon in the atmosphere, you're worried about the wrong thing. Because it's all the things that go with the carbon, and it's all the systems that have allowed the accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere that we've got to keep looking at and keep being worried about. Next. What I mean when I say that is this is a study that was just published earlier this week. Some of y'all may have seen the headlines. This is a Harvard University School of Engineering, which engineering schools are not normally excited to say things like this, but they did a study of air pollution, not carbon. Air pollution is PM 2.5. It's particulate matter that is emitted in the same process that emits carbon. There is particulate air pollution, particulate matter in almost all of those same processes. And they found what we've known for a long time, which is that fossil fuel combustion emits particulate matter and that particulate matter is harmful to health. We've known that for a long time. What they did was quantify that roughly 1 in 5 deaths globally are caused by particulate air pollution. That is a fact I want you to sit with. 1 in 5 deaths globally caused by particulate matter. This is the stuff that our state is consistently permitting these facilities to continue emitting in communities around Louisiana. Next. When we talk about petrochemicals, the footprint of pollution and of health impacts from plastics and petrochemicals is enormous in the state of Louisiana. Plastics are poison. They are poison before they became plastics, when they were oil and gas and other feedstocks. They're plastics all through they're poison all through the manufacturing process, and then they're poison again when they become waste. And in the state of Louisiana, we are carrying this entire burden. And of course, it's not all of us. It's concentrated. This burden is concentrated in what the government calls the industrial corridor, and what we know as Cancer Alley and increasingly as Death Alley. That's where that particulate air pollution is accumulating, and that's where the majority of those excess deaths in Louisiana are happening. Next. The fourth thing I want you to take away from this is that I want to commend that the Louisiana governor has created a climate initiatives task force. Every state hasn't done that. We are right now breaking new ground on this climate initiatives task force. Unfortunately, the people that the governor has chosen for the task force overrepresent oil and gas. Next. There's a lot of text on this slide. This is a list of everyone who is on the quote unquote task force. What you see here looks like a diverse list, but by my count, there are at least 10 people on this list that are either directly employed by or have contracted and worked for, or are by some mix paid by the oil and gas and petrochemical industries, including both of the designees of our elected bodies, the Senate and the Speaker of the House, the Senate President and the Speaker of the House, both designated oil and gas representatives as their designees on this task force. But the task force is only part of the story. Next. Because this task force has subcommittees and it has advisory groups. And let me tell you a little bit about those subcommittees and advisory groups. They are mostly men, they are mostly white people, and they are vastly overpopulated by industry and industry-aligned nonprofit representatives who are openly advocating for carbon capture as the solution. A big chunk of them mentioned carbon capture in their introductions at the first meetings of each of the subcommittees and advisory groups. This is a serious problem. The mandates of each of these committees and advisory groups in many cases neglected concerns about health and public safety. And when those concerns were brought up to these subcommittees, some of them added them to their mandates, and many of them said things like, oh, that's represented on the equity group. There's a medical doctor on the equity group. There are people of color on the equity group. And if all of the concerns about health and public safety are funneled to one advisory group and not across the task force and all of its subcommittees, we have a problem. The other thing about this task force and its subcommittees is that they have very long, frankly, very not thrilling meetings that happen really irregularly. They don't have a regular published schedule that they abide by. We've frequently gotten less than 48 hours notice about a 3-hour meeting. I don't know about y'all, but I have a job and a kid and a dog and a husband and a house I have to keep clean. To have less than 48 hours notice on a 3-hour meeting that takes place in the middle of the workday when all of those things I just listed are in my house right now because of the pandemic, this is unwieldy, and it does not favor public participation. So we came up with a solution to that. Next, we have actually created a space where we can accumulate power to influence the outcomes of the task force. We have that power. We need to actually be using it. So next, we have friends and allies on several of the subcommittees. We have identified the people who will be open to us talking to them, and we have come in force to make public comment, to feed into this process, and to develop our own parallel People's Climate Initiatives plan. This task force that is advising the governor is going to come out with a report. They're going to make a recommendation to him. Some of it is about policy, some of it is about practice, and we're going to do the same thing because we believe that the companies that got us into this mess are not going to get us out of it. We are going to get us out of it. So this is your call to action. I'm sorry that I'm not even sure if someone else is supposed to make the call to action, but you can do a second one if you are. The call to action here is that this group meets every other Tuesday at 3:00 in the afternoon. Our next meeting is this coming Tuesday, so consider this an invitation. If you would like the information for the call, you can email me and I'll put my email in the chat. We would love to have you participating in this conversation. It is open to anybody. And what we do in this conversation is we do two things. We help prepare people for how to make public comment, and we decide how we're going to spread out those public comments so that all of our points get made. And I got to tell you, it's really easy. And the second thing is that we are, as I said, developing an alternative People's Climate Plan. And this is under the auspices of Gulf South for a Green New Deal. So if you're not familiar with what the policy platform is and what its principles are, that People's Climate Plan is going to be built under those principles. And the URL is right there for you. It's Gulf South, 4 GND.org. We've got 2 URLs with the 4 of them in a row. I love it. And so go to that website and send me an email. I will put it in the chat. And we would love to have you because this is going to take all of us to overcome what these industries are trying to do to us again. And thank you guys for having me to speak to.